Hello, everyone. Welcome to our USD webinar with the topic IT Outsourcing and Responsibility. My name is Tobias Weber, and I will be presenting the webinar today. I work at USD as an IT security auditor. I do different IT security audits. A main focus is on the PCI DSS, also a topic where you often deal with service provider relationships, which will be, of course, the main topic for today. So, regarding our agenda, we see that we start with the general topic of IT outsourcing, where we will want to cover some of the basics, try to define what IT outsourcing is, what kinds of aspects are relevant for the relationship between service providers and their clients. We will look at the topic of responsibility in these kinds of relationships and also the challenges that arise from these kinds of relationships. In the last part of the webinar, we want to look at some of the possibilities we have in order to mitigate these challenges. We want to look at service provider management, how we can do this better, and look at one special measure to manage a service provider in a better way, namely service provider audits. Initially, I also want to mention that the slides will be made available after the webinar, so you can all sit back, relax, and do not need to take any notes. So, regarding IT outsourcing. So, the first question is why do we want to outsource anything at all? Why do we, so to speak, not do things ourselves? Of course, the main driver in this regard is financial advantages. We want, or we hope that our service provider will do things with less cost than if we would do them internally. Possibly they have advantages because the quantity of service, so to speak, that they deliver to other clients too is higher, and therefore they have some effects which on the whole make it cheaper. Also, of course, things that we want to outsource are usually not our core business, and therefore we also have to hope that our service provider will be more proficient in these let's say fringe aspects of our business, so that we can concentrate on doing the things we do well, and do not need to bother with anything surrounding it. Another part here is, of course, improved service. This is very much related. Again, we hope that our service provider can provide a service in a more professional way than we could. For example, if you look at a data center or at a cloud provider like AWS, that will provide a level of service and professionality that many, in particular smaller companies, will have a very, very hard time achieving. Yeah, this is another reason why we would outsource our business processes. And the third part is, of course, ease of management. If we outsource some parts of our operation, we do not need to deal with things like managing personnel. We do not need to train anyone for these kinds of things, and we can concentrate on our core business. So, as there are some reasons for outsourcing, there's also some risks that are, of course, associated with it. First of all, of course, we have financial risk. In some configurations of these relationships, it can happen that either the service provider maybe is not in effect cheaper than if we would do it ourselves. Maybe using the service provider even yields additional costs. One good example regarding this is, of course, the risk of a security breach at the service provider. Usually this will involve also customer data that is associated with our business, and in many cases this means that there will be financial repercussions on our business, even though it was, in quotes, only the service provider that has been breached. I think I do not need to go further into what this does for the perception within the public, and I think it's also not necessary to mention that this kind of perception always falls back to the client of the service provider, to the one who is actually accountable for the service that is done here. Another part of this is, of course, the risk that the quality that the service provider delivers is not completely in line with what we assume or what we see as our level of service that we want to provide to our clients. This can lead to more employee resistance if it is a service that is only provided to internal divisions, but it is even more profound when you look at service providers that actually deal directly with your customers. So outsourcing definitely is not without risk either. So let's take a look at the things that define this relationship between the client and the service provider. Typically, this relationship starts with the contract, with the SLAs, and with everything that is attached to this contract. These are typically written before the service provider is engaged. The purpose of them is to define the terms in which the service is provided and to define how the level of service that the service provider delivers, what it should be like. This is pretty much what SLAs are made for. These are typically written down. They are somewhat concrete. The big downside of those two is, of course, that they have been written down before the service provider is engaged. So before anyone has seen what this whole arrangement looks like in real life. Another part that is, or another document that is usually part of a contract is some kind of division of responsibility. This should state in which business processes the service provider has a responsibility and how it is divided with the client. This should lay down the interfaces that are there between the client and the service provider, and should be as detailed as possible. Going into further detail, we have written documentation that exists between client and service providers. These can be, for example, process descriptions, hardening guidelines, or operating guidelines for applications. And this written documentation is typically not part of the contract, but still something that is written down that is usually much more detailed than what is in the contract, but also something where we have the danger of it being outdated at some point, as with all documentation. This written documentation and these process descriptions, in turn, usually would contain in some form the communication channels that exist between the client and the service provider, where it is laid down in which circumstances the service provider needs to contact the client, how they contact the client, with what means, in which form, and this is particularly important. We will get to this later when it comes to IT security incidents. Something that is less is of course usually not written down are oral agreements. These this is something that also we see in our work again and again, that there are negotiations between clients and service providers that are not part of the contract, but that have been agreed on only in a verbal form, and that are therefore very difficult to verify because, of course, there is no documentation for them. And going further into things that are tremendously important, but often very non-concrete, very fuzzy, is the actual performance of the service provider. Of course, we can measure and try to measure the performance of the service provider in terms of KPIs. Somehow we try to build it into our SLAs, but naturally, these have been defined before we engaged our service provider. Maybe they are updated, but often not frequently. And whether the actual performance of the service provider is in line with what we expect, and maybe even in line with what we had in mind when we wrote the contract, is very often a thing that is very difficult to understand and to find out. And to go even further, the perception that we have of our service provider's performance, especially if we belong to some management position where we do not usually come into contact with the day-to-day dealings, is even less concrete and is even more prone to situations where your perception is maybe blurred by concrete incidents, which maybe do not describe what is the norm of the service provider's performance. And yeah, this is there is yet another gap here between the actual performance or between the perception of the performance of the service provider, the actual performance, and what we measure in our KPIs. So to go further into the topic of responsibility in these kinds of relationships, I want to talk about the division of responsibility. As mentioned earlier, we want to lay down what each party is responsible for, which parts of the business process each party performs, where each party is, as we would define in a RACI matrix, for example, where each party is responsible, accountable, consulted, or informed. This is, of course, only one way to do it. Yeah, some documentation like this is very often a part of regulatory frameworks, like PCI DSS requires that in 12.8. Also in your ISO 27K and in other frameworks, you will find requirements for a clear division and documented division of responsibility with your service providers, because it is such an important part of this relationship. And without this, it is very likely that things will not be done in the way in which they are expected to be done. I want to go into two different examples of this kind of division of responsibility. First one is this managed service provider case, in which the service is is defined by or the responsibilities are defined by the corresponding services that are provided. This from a high level perspective, of course, looks very simple. For example, there's many cases in which there is a service provider that does the IT infrastructure, up to the from bare metal to the operating system, and the client is then responsible for delivering the application on those machines. But there, of course, are other cases too. For example, network monitoring or telecommunications, where the service provider would maybe provide the email infrastructure or the voice over IP infrastructure for their client. Here we see, however, when we look closely, that the details of this kind of responsibility can be very complex, because in all of these cases we have exceptions, where maybe the service provider is expected to do more than only the operating system in some cases, or where there are other kinds of interfaces between the client and the service provider, which are sometimes not as clear cut and which need to be defined in a more detailed way. Another example of this is incident response. Incident response is something that you should always have in mind whenever there is any kind of IT service provider relationship, where some data is processed that is in some way valuable for you. So usually when there is an incident, an IT security incident in particular, what you want to have is you want to act very quickly. You want to act in a coordinated way, and to achieve this, of course, communication is really important. On the bottom of the slide, you see a timeline of an incident just regarding communication, and we see that first, when the incident occurs, there is a gap until the service provider detects the incident. In this case, it is the service provider. It might also be you as the client, but let's assume it is the service provider. And this the service provider then needs to inform you as the client, who in turn needs to inform possibly other legal entities, because of legal obligations you have, maybe to your clients. In Germany, in some cases, you need to consult the BSI. So there are a number of things that need to be taken care of here. And to ensure that when your service provider detects the incident, that they actually reach the right place in your organization, and that they provide the information in the correct way, that they start doing response in exactly the way you expect. For this, it is necessary to have a plan. So from my perspective, it is really a best practice to, for one, have a coordinated plan that is regularly updated, and even more, to perform regular training exercises together with the service provider, to ensure that the communication channels are known, that all the procedures are known, and that that if something happens, everyone knows exactly what to do. Here also, I want to stress accountability in the public perception, of course, will always lie with the client here. If your customer's data is breached, people will look at you. They will not look at the service provider. To continue with the challenges in these relationships, we have seen so far that there are different ingredients, different layers that define this relationship with service providers. And we have talked about responsibilities between different service providers, between you and your service providers. So the challenges in these relationships that are defined by these things are such that, as mentioned earlier, SLAs, KPIs, responsibilities are usually documented, but often not in a good way, often not in an adequate way. This is something that I see again and again in PCI DSS and in other assessments, where you have some division of responsibility, but it either does not reflect anymore what the actual state is, so who is actually performing which kinds of processes, or they are defined in a too abstract manner to actually depict the granularity that is involved in these processes. Another part that is important here is that service providers usually act as black boxes. This is what you want from them, and this is what you expect from them. You do not want to see their internal processes. But very often, in particular in these cases, this is in some ways desirable, because it is often not clear whether things that are laid down in the contract are actually understood by both parties, and whether these things are actually performed by the service provider, in particular if there are things that you normally do not ask about. Things get even more complicated when there are signs of inadequate performance, because then you, or maybe your management, has the perception that the service provider does not deliver what they should deliver, and because your SLAs, your KPIs do not reflect correctly the relationship and the services that are being provided, it is very difficult to have this discussion, and it is very difficult to actually know whether there has been a contract breach, or whether this is maybe just an exception where something went wrong. So and of course, again, it is difficult to see whether there are structural deficiencies in the service provider, or whether there are structural deficiencies in your relationship with the service provider, because these things often remain hidden from you. Yeah, so these are the questions that are that you often see in these kinds of relationships, that the client wonders whether the performance is inadequate, whether maybe the perception is wrong. Often you see some kind of discussion by examples of single incidents in these kinds of relationships, and people wonder what can be done to improve the cooperation and to mitigate this. To go further into some of the common pitfalls that we see, of course, we have employee resistance. In the title of the webinar, there is the word outsourcing. This is something that a lot of people are very wary of. Often you have situations where maybe your employees, or some of the employees, have some maybe already history with the service provider, and therefore block some things, or have some other kind of resistance. Another pitfall is that sometimes outsourcing is just not completely aligned with the strategic objectives of the organization. Maybe outsourcing something is not really what you want, because maybe you want to have more control over how exactly something is done. This is something that needs to be thought about before engaging a service provider. This is also something that might change with time, and this is something that needs to be continuously evaluated. Another pitfall is that supplier selection, so the part of your organization that selects service providers, simply does not appoint the right provider, because maybe not all the requirements that you had for the service provider were known. Maybe not, maybe the scope in which they were necessary at the service provider's infrastructure were known in the beginning, and therefore a service provider that cannot or does not deliver the adequate service has been chosen, and now you're in a situation where it would be very costly and very difficult to change your service provider. On the other side of the triangle here, we have a lack of skills and resources, of course, when it comes to managing the relationship, when it comes to defining and keeping current SLAs, KPIs, and the responsibilities. Contract management is something that needs to be actively done. You need to continuously work with your service provider, give them feedback, do lessons learned, and this is something that I see lacking in a lot of organizations. And as a last point, of course, we have the customer perception to outsourcing, to offshoring, where of course, when your service provider has direct interaction with your customers, it cannot always be, it is sometimes difficult to make sure that the level of service, the level of quality that you want to deliver is actually reaching your customers in these cases. So what can we do about these kinds of challenges? Essentially, managing your service provider is a type of quality management. What we see here is a kind of modified plan, do, check, act circle or cycle. where the service provider relationship, of course, always starts with the selection of the supplier and with awarding a contract. Here, our SLAs, our KPIs should be defined, and next we should actively manage the contract. This means that we have regular talks with our service provider, where we look at what has been happening. This can be something that you do quarterly. I know some entities that do this monthly with important service providers, and where you review their performance, measure it against the parameters that you have defined, and where you do a lessons learned for the things that have been happening lately. This review of the performance against the defined parameters and lessons learned possibly can also happen in a less frequent time frame. But what it should usually result in is that you look at the parameters and the measurements of performance that you put in, and you try to find out, or you try to compare them with what you actually expect from your service provider and with what your strategic goals are, because these might change, and so possibly should the parameters with which you manage your, or with which you measures your with which you measure your service provider's performance. When this is done, possibly you need to adjust contracts, and again you should begin with actively managing the contract, and this way we get this kind of cycle. As a special measure that can be used to review the performance of the service provider, I want to introduce these service provider audits. So first of all, why do we want to do an audit? With an audit, we get an objective assessment through a third party that whose view has not been tainted with the history that you might have with your service provider, and who can have a holistic and a fresh view on what your relationship looks like. As an outcome, you usually get an audit report with which you have a recorded snapshot of what the situation currently looks like, what the service provider's performance is. And with this, if done regularly, or even with this as a basis or as a base, you can continuously track and put in measures for improvement of the quality of your relationship with your service provider, and probably also of your service provider's performance. This also provides you with the means of ensuring that you have a fair perception of what your service provider delivers, a fair assessment of your own perception, which maybe does not completely reflect the especially for roles that are further from the operational business, from the day-to-day business. To find out whether there is a gap, and to have a more clear view of what things are like. What does such an audit look like? So initially, you would perform a workshop to find out what is the relationship between the service provider and the client like. What are the current issues? Which kinds of documentation are there? What needs to be taken into account? This is essentially the base for the second phase, the preparation. where we get into one of the difficulties of such an audit, because here we do not know beforehand what the actual requirements, controls, and audit activities are. So what we want to do is we want to use the issues that you have. We want to use the contract, the KPIs, the SLAs, and from these derive requirements, which in turn we can use to derive controls and audit activities, which we will use in the assessment to find out whether the service that your service provider delivers is adequate and is in line with what you've set out and with what you expect. Of course, here also we have the audit planning with the service provider, and in the actual audit then interviews, document review, and eventually, of course, the presentation of the audit results, both as a written and as a discussion in an oral presentation. And of course, this should also include recommendations for improvement. How can you work better with your service provider? Which kind of issues have been identified? And eventually, this should lead to tracking the open points and therefore thereby improving the way that you work with your service provider. As I mentioned, one difficulty here, or one thing that is unclear in the beginning, is to find adequate requirements for the assessment. What I have seen several times is that these kinds of assessments can be based on internal policies of the client, in particular when the service provider is bound to fulfill them. They often provide a very good base for assessments like this, but it can also be based on process descriptions or other internal standards. Also, external standards are a very common source of such requirements, often in regulatory contexts like PCI DSS. It is mandatory to also assess the service provider if they are within the scope and if they are relevant for the regulatory requirements. Other possibilities are to assess regarding the maturity of the processes, so for example CMMI or against ITIL. But of course, one can also be more concrete to the relationship and use SLAs, KPIs, and maybe things that are written down in the contracts themselves as a base for these requirements. Sometimes it makes sense to perform an audit against specific questions, like doing a review of change management and how things are handled from your service provider's side, because usually, or in many cases, you will have some kind of common change management or some kind of interface here. Maybe you also want to look at how the reaction for specific incidents has been handled and why some decisions were made and with what reasoning. Another possibility is, of course, that you want to look into the concepts that are used to implement a new project and to see whether things are there going in accordance with what you expect or what you require from a regulatory standpoint, or also from regarding your internal policies. So these are the things that you would discuss in the kickoff and in the preparation phase for such an audit. to get into the topic of results and to the end of the presentation, of course, eventually the results of the audit need to be evaluated and need to be presented in the report and to you and your management. And this kind of report can be used as an objective foundation for finding next steps, for defining the to-dos that you have to improve the relationship that you have with your service provider. And these should be target oriented. These should be objective recommendations, and an experienced auditor will be able to give you such recommendations based on what is considered best practice in the industry and for you. Okay, with this, I'm finished with my presentation. I thank you very much. Before we go to the questions, I want to make you aware of our next event. This will be on 12th of November. It is our USD PCI best practice workshop, where we will be talking about PCI 4.0, probably the biggest change in the standard since it has been released initially. And I can only recommend this event to you. To find other webinars and to generally stay up to date, please follow us on the different platforms. And yes, now I am available for questions. So if you have any questions, please. Okay, so one question is whether I have an example template regarding questions or topics that a client would include in such an audit. Yeah, this is a kind of difficult question to answer. Let me go back a little. So this is essentially a question about the requirements that you want to put for this kind of audit. And these requirements, of course, highly depend on the kind of service that your service provider provides. And they also depend a lot on your needs. So I think that this is something that needs to be figured out in a workshop before, and that generally it is very difficult to have a one-size-fits-all solution for this. Typically, it is oriented on the things that I have on the slide here. So I think in particular your SLAs, KPIs, documentation with the service provider, common documentation that you have would be a good base for this. I have also seen situations where your service, where a new service provider should be engaged, or where maybe a company is being bought, and this would involve that the internal policies of the buying company should be followed by the bought company. And in these cases, of course, you would try to take the policies of the mother company and use those to assess whether there are any gaps and whether this has any kinds of effects. So we have another question. How can objective criteria be established for measuring performance of service providers when outsourcing expectations have been drafted badly when signing the contract? So this essentially goes back to this cycle that I presented. Yes, of course, it is very difficult to find objective criteria for measuring the performance of service providers, in particular because it is a moving target. The expectation that you have is something that is subject to change within your organization and possibly also within the organization of the service provider. The way to achieve some or better criteria that are objective is of course to talk to your service provider and to actively manage the relationship that you have to each other regarding this. So to do regular lessons learned, to regular evaluate the performance, to regular reset the parameters and the ways you measure performance, and to adjust them to what you expect and what your business needs right now. Okay, I hope this answers the question. Okay, then. I think that is it then. Here you see my contact details again. So if you have any further questions, I'm very happy to discuss with you. And with this, our webinar has come to an end. Thank you all very much for your attention, and have a nice day. Bye bye.